Sealing a draft in the smokehouse, he uncovered a woman who'd hidden all winter. The caulking iron was cold in my hand. That's the first thing. I remember how the cold worked up through the handle and into my palm, and I kept blowing on my fingers between strokes. Stupid, half-useless habit, but you do it anyway. While I tried to force the oakum into the gap along the south wall of the smokehouse, where the boards had dried and pulled apart just enough to let the weather in. 3-4 inches of open sky if you crouched and looked, and the hams I'd hung in there in November were getting nothing but air instead of smoke every time the wind turned wrong. So that Sunday, late January, I finally got to it. I'd been putting it off, that's the honest answer. The winter had gone long and strange, and I had a list of things I kept not doing, which isn't my nature. I'm not a man who lets things sit. But that particular winter I was getting up in the mornings and going through the motions without much feeling behind any of it. The horse got fed. The water got hauled. The fire got banked. The rest of it, the repairs and the improvements, they collected on a piece of paper I kept folded in my breast pocket and didn't look at. I put my shoulder into the smokehouse door. It sticks in cold weather. The wood swells, and when it came open I had a moment of thinking I'd gone blind. It was just the dark. The contrast between the white outside and the inside, no windows, no light, just my lantern barely throwing its circle. I could smell it the way you always can. Old smoke and old salt, and the faint sweetness of the cured meat, and something underneath that I almost didn't register, because I was already moving toward the south wall with my caulking iron and my bucket of oakum. Then I heard her breathe. I don't know how else to put it. It wasn't a sound. It was a breath, slow, controlled, somebody trying not to make a sound and making a sound anyway. And I stopped. Put my hand back on the door I just let swing shut, found the latch, held it. My heart was doing something I can't describe, not fear exactly, but the body's alarm, the thing that happens before you've decided what to do. I lifted the lantern. She was in the corner farthest from the door, behind the second row of hanging hams, wrapped in what I later understood was a horse blanket she'd pulled off my fence post in October. I'd wondered where that went, and her eyes were open, and she was looking at me the way a cornered thing looks, not wild but still, waiting to see what I'd do. I stood there a long time. The lantern made shadows jump. "Ma'am," I said, because what else do you say? She didn't answer. She pulled the blanket tighter, and I could see her jaw was set in a way that told me she'd already made up her mind about something. What that was I couldn't say. "I'm going to set this lantern on the nail there," I said, "and I'm going to step outside and I'd ask you to stay put." I kept my voice at a level I'd use for a spooked animal, not soft exactly, just even. "I'm not going to send for anyone. I'm just going to get you something hot to drink and I'll be back in 10 minutes. She still didn't say anything, but she didn't move. I went to the house and put the coffee pot on and stood at the window looking out at the smokehouse, and my heart was still doing that thing. My mind was working through what I knew, which was almost nothing. A woman, young enough, maybe 25, maybe 30, in my smokehouse, alive in January. And it was January that mattered because I was thinking about when the cold had come in hard. The middle of October it was. And she'd been there since then at least, long enough to know about the blanket, to know the smokehouse didn't get used much in winter after the hams were hung, to know I wouldn't be in and out. She'd chosen this place and this timing with some care. That told me something about her situation. I filled a tin cup and wrapped a cloth around it and went back. She hadn't moved. I set the cup down on the floor 5 feet from her, went back to the wall, sat on an empty barrel. "Drink that," I said. "It's cold in here." She looked at the cup a long time. Then she reached for it, and when the blanket shifted I could see her hands, and I won't say they shocked me because I'd been imagining something like this, but it still sat in my chest a certain way. Her knuckles were cracked and dark with old cold sores. 2 of her fingers had rags wound around them that might have started as bandages, and she moved with the careful deliberateness of someone whose body is conserving what little it has left. She drank the coffee, both hands around the cup. Her eyes came up to me over the rim, and whatever she'd been waiting to see in my face, I don't know if she found it, but some of the stillness in her shifted. "How long?" I said. She looked at the cup. "I won't do anything about it," I said. "I just want to know." "Since the first hard freeze," she said. Her voice was low and a little rough, which made sense if she hadn't been talking to anyone. The first hard freeze had been the 3rd week of October. That was 3 months. I sat with that for a moment. "And you've been eating what?" "There's more than you'd think in here." She tilted her head slightly toward the hams, the dried things hanging from the hooks. "I didn't take much at a time. I thought if I was careful." She stopped. "If you were careful, I wouldn't notice." I nodded. "You were pretty careful." Because I hadn't, not really, though I'd thought the hams were going slower than expected, but there are 100 reasons for that and I hadn't pushed on it. She said nothing. "Are you hurt anywhere?" The pause before she answered was long enough to tell me she was deciding how much to say. "My feet," she finally said. "Early on, they're better now." "Frostbite," she meant, "or near enough." "You'd better come inside," I said. She shook her head, a short, definite thing. "I'm not asking you to tell me anything," I said. "I'm not asking you anything at all except to come out of the cold. You can have the back room, door locks from inside." I looked at her. "I'll leave you alone." She looked at the cup again for a long time. Then she said, "Are you alone here?" "I am," I said. Another silence. "Do you have a wife?" "I did," I said. "She's gone 5 years." Something moved in her face that I couldn't read. Then she said, "All right." Her name was Ada Greer. She told me that first evening when I'd set out food and she'd eaten it, plain things. Corn bread and salted pork and beans I'd had keeping warm on the back of the stove. Eaten it in the quiet, intent way of someone whose body has been running on less than it needed for a long time. Ada Greer. She said it the way you say a thing you've been holding on to, like it costs something to let it out. I didn't ask what came after it, the last name she used and whether it was still hers and what it attached to. I didn't ask. I'd learn in time what she wanted me to know, and what she didn't want me to know I'd respect. That was the arrangement I'd made in my own head before she ever came inside, and I held to it. I gave her the back room that had been my daughter's, empty since Willa married and went to Cheyenne 7 years before. There was a bed in there and a quilt that Willa hadn't taken and a small stove that I got going before Ada came upstairs. I showed her where the water was, where the lamp oil was kept. I said goodnight and I went to my room, and I lay there a long time listening to the quiet. In the morning she was still there. I don't know why I'd half expected her not to be, but I had. She came down while I was making breakfast, and she stood in the doorway of the kitchen and she said, "I can work." I looked at her. She was wearing the same clothes she'd come in with, which were not much. I'd been trying to think about that without it seeming like I was thinking about it. "All right," I said. "I'm not a charity case," she said. "I don't want to be kept." "I understand that." "Then say it plain. If you want me to work for the room, say so, and I will. If you want something else—" She stopped. Her jaw did the thing it had done in the smokehouse that set. "There's a good deal that needs doing," I said. "Cooking, mending, the house has gotten away from me. I'll be straight with you. I live alone and it shows. If you want to work for the room, that's fair and I'll say so." She studied me. "That's all." "That's all." She didn't quite believe it. I could see that. But she nodded and came to the stove, and I moved aside and let her. We had 10 days like that before they came. 10 days that I think about now in the way you think about a run of good weather before a bad storm. You don't know it's the last of it while you're in it. But looking back, you can see it clearly, the specific quality of those days, and how you were almost happy without calling it that. She cooked well, better than I had any right to expect, and she put the house in order with the quiet efficiency of someone who has always known how to work. She didn't talk much, but what she said was direct and often right, and I noticed I'd start waiting for her to say things. I was fixing a fence line on the east pasture one afternoon, and I came back at dusk, and she'd been through the loft and found tools I'd forgotten I had, and she'd laid them out on the workbench in an arrangement that made more sense than what I'd been doing. And I stood there looking at it, and then I went inside and didn't say anything about it because sometimes you just have to let a thing sit and carry its own weight. She'd brought herself back from where she'd been. That was the other thing I noticed. Not just the obvious, the color coming back into her face, the way she stopped moving like she was in pain, but something underneath. She'd had a way at first of checking the windows when she came into a room, just a quick look, a habit, and by the fourth or fifth day I realized she wasn't doing it as much. I noticed things like that. I had more time to look than I'd had in years. On the third day she came into the barn while I was working on a harness collar that had cracked through the winter, and she didn't say anything, just looked at what I had laid out on the bench, the awl and the wax thread and the leather scraps I'd been using to test the patch, and she picked up the awl and turned it in her fingers and said, "My father did this." She set it down. Harness work. He wasn't bad at it. She went back to the house. I don't know why that stuck, but it did. On the sixth day, there was a blow that came in from the northwest and put 2 feet of new snow down in about 6 hours, and we were inside all afternoon and into the evening. She'd found my set of almanacs from the previous 4 years and was reading through them at the kitchen table with the kind of attention you give a thing when you're genuinely interested and not just passing time. I was at the stove and I looked over at her once, just for a moment. And she had her chin resting on her hand and a little furrow between her brows, reading, and the lamp was going, and the snow was hitting the window, and it occurred to me that the kitchen had been empty for a long time and wasn't empty now. I put the thought away, and did not take it back out for several days. On the 9th day she found the crack in the stone on the back of the hearth that I'd been meaning to have a mason look at, and she came to find me in the barn and told me it needed attention before spring because water would get into it with the thaw and split it worse. She was right. I knew she was right. I said, "I'll get to it." She said, "You said that about the smokehouse." I looked at her. She looked back very straight. "Fair point," I said. "I'll mix the mortar," she said, "if you'll do the work inside the firebox. My arms aren't long enough." We did it that afternoon. It was close work, uncomfortable, the two of us on our knees at the hearth, and at one point she had to steady the edge of the slate with both hands while I set the mortar behind it, and her shoulder was against mine, and neither of us moved away. When it was done, she sat back and looked at the repair and said, "Good," just that. The word landed plain and right. I noticed things like that. I had more time to look than I'd had in years. On the 8th day she told me a little of it, not all, standing at the kitchen table shelling dried beans with her hands moving steady and her eyes on the bowl. A husband she'd left in Colorado territory. A man named Whitlow who had people spread across 2 counties, brothers and a cousin who worked for him, and who had not taken her leaving in a way that allowed her to simply leave. She'd run in September. She'd gotten farther north than she'd planned because she was trying to lose the direction of herself, make it harder to follow. "He'll have told people I stole from him," she said. "That's what he does. He'll have made a case." I said, "Is there a case to make?" "I took a horse," she said. "I left the horse in Laramie and took a stage north, and I left the stage early because I thought I'd seen one of his cousin's men on it, and I walked." She looked up at me for just a moment. "I ended up here." "And the horse?" "He'll count it as stolen." Her hands didn't stop moving. "It wasn't. But he'll count it." I sat with that. "How many men does he have?" She shook her head. "Enough." "Would he come this far?" Her hand stopped. "He would come to the end of the earth," she said, and there was something in her voice that told me she wasn't afraid of him the way a person is afraid of something large. She was afraid of him the way you're afraid of something that already happened to you once. I said, "All right." She looked at me. "All right what?" All right, I know what I need to know, I said. Keep shelling those. They came on a Thursday, 12 days after I'd found her. I'd been half expecting it and hadn't said so, because saying so would have taken the 10 days from her, and she needed those days. But I'd been thinking about it, and I'd moved some things, and I'd had a conversation with Hoke Barber, who ran the livery in town, about a man named Whitlow, and whether anyone had been asking questions, and Hoke had said not that he'd heard, which was the best I could hope for. 2 men. One of them was young, a writer, the kind you hire for particular jobs. The other one was older and had a way of sitting a horse that made me think he'd done this before. I was in the yard splitting wood when they rode in. Ada was in the house. I'd told her if anyone rode in she should stay inside and not come to the window, and she'd said she wasn't going to hide in someone else's house, and I'd said she was going to do it this once, and she'd given me a look that meant she hadn't agreed but she might do it anyway. The older one did the talking. He said he was looking for a woman named Ada Whitlow, that she'd run off from her lawful husband and taken property with her, and that he had papers. He held up a folded document. I couldn't read it from where I stood. I set the axe down and I looked at him. What kind of papers? Complaint, he said. Filed in Colorado territory. Her husband wants her back. Her husband, I said, or the horse? He looked at me. Both. I see. I picked up a piece of wood and set it on the block without picking the axe back up. I don't know a woman named Ada Whitlow. I know a woman named Ada Greer who's been helping me run this place since November. She came recommended by my brother in Laramie, which I can show you in writing if you need it. I had written that letter myself 3 days before. She doesn't match your description except in the general sense that she's a woman. The older one looked at the house. Mind if we take a look? I do mind, I said. A pause, Mr. Cal, I said. Thomas Cal, this is my place and I'm telling you I mind. A lawful complaint. In Colorado territory, I said, which is not here. And a wife leaving a husband is not a crime I know of, whatever he told you to put on those papers. A horse taken in distress is between her and him and a judge, and I don't see a judge. I looked at the young one, then back to the older one. I have work to do. I'm asking you to ride out. The young one's hand moved toward his hip, a reflex, and I said without raising my voice much, that would be a mistake. He stopped. The older one looked at me a long time. He was measuring something. Men like that, they do the job they're paid for up to the point the job costs more than it's worth, and he was figuring the math. Tell her, he finally said, that Whitlow knows where she is. I don't know who you mean, I said, but I'll keep it in mind. They rode out. I stood and watched them until I couldn't see them anymore, and then I went inside. Ada was not at the window. She was standing in the middle of the kitchen with her hands flat on the table, and when I came in she said, I heard. I thought you might. You lied for me. I went to the stove and checked the coffee pot out of habit. I told them my hired woman came recommended by my brother. You don't have a brother. I might. I turned around. Ada, those men are done. Men like that, you call their question and they go back and tell the man who hired them it wasn't worth the trouble. Whitlow can file papers all he likes. He's in Colorado territory and you're in Wyoming, and you're not his wife in any way that matters to any court I know of up here. She was looking at me. You don't know that. I know this valley, I said, and I know the men in it, and I know you've been doing honest work in my house since November. I corrected it. Since January, and no man with paper from another territory is going to walk onto this place and take you. She said, why? I didn't understand at first what she was asking. Why would you do that? She said, not challenging, genuine, like she actually didn't know the answer and needed it. I looked at her hand still flat on the table. The fingers that had been wrapped in rags when I found her, healed up now. The set of her jaw, which I'd gotten used to reading, and it wasn't set now. It was open in a way I hadn't seen before, the question right there in her face like a door ajar. Because it's right, I said. And because you earned it, I paused. You didn't ask me for anything. You survived in a smokehouse for 3 months on your own before I found you. You've worked every day since you came inside. You owe me nothing. I thought about how to say the rest of it and decided to say it plain. You're not a charity case. I'm not keeping you. You're here because you chose to stay. She looked at me a long time. Then she said, I did choose to stay. It landed differently than I expected. Not like something stated, like something settled. The rest of the winter went slow and fine. I don't mean nothing happened. Things happened. The cattle needed moving after a storm buried the east pasture. A section of fence came down and we spent 2 cold days putting it back. My old mare went lame and I sat up 2 nights with her before she came right. There was a week in February when the temperature dropped so low the water in the kitchen pail froze overnight, and we burned through wood faster than I'd planned. But the days went fine, that's what I mean. She'd started talking more. Not because she became a different person. Ada was always going to be a woman who chose her words, but because the watching had eased off, the constant assessment of whether things were safe. And when a person stops using that much energy on vigilance, there's more left over for other things. She told me about where she came from, a farm in Missouri, her mother dead early, her father a hard man but not cruel. 2 brothers. She'd had more schooling than most, which was her father's doing. He believed in that if in little else. She'd gone west because the farm was the brothers and there was nothing in Missouri for her, and she'd taken a job, and the job had led to Whitlow, and she'd been too young and too far from home to see what she was walking into until she was already in it. I should have run sooner, she said. We were sitting after supper, the stove throwing heat, and outside the wind had picked up and was doing something to the eaves that made a sound like a complaint. You ran when you ran, I said. 3 years, she said. That's a long time to wait. Sometimes it takes that long to know for sure. I looked at the fire. Sometimes it takes longer. She looked at me. Is that speaking from experience? I thought about it. Some things I've known slow, I said. Yes. She was quiet a minute. What things? I didn't answer right away. I picked up the tin cup and turned it in my hands, a habit. When my wife died, I said, I spent a good while thinking I'd missed something I should have done or said or been, I don't know what. And it took me a long time to stop going over it and just let it have been what it was. I set the cup down. That's a slow kind of knowing. She was watching me. What was her name? Ellie, I said. A moment. She was loved, Ada said, not a question. She was, I said. Something shifted in Ada's face. A softening, not sad exactly. More like she'd understood something about the kind of man I was. I don't know if she'd been uncertain before, but she didn't look uncertain now. In March the weather broke for a week, that false thaw you always get before the last of winter comes back. The snow pulled off the south-facing slopes, and the pasture showed through in patches, and the light changed, went longer and yellower, and you could smell something on the air that wasn't winter. It's the smell that makes a man go out and stand in a field for no reason. I was out there one afternoon just standing like I said, when she came out of the house and walked across the yard and stood next to me. Not close, a few feet off. We both looked out at the slopes. After a while she said, What did you put in on the south pasture last year? Grass, I said. Previous owner had it in wheat, but it's wrong for wheat up here. I'm building toward cattle. I paused. Takes time. But you know what you're doing. I know what I'm working toward, I said. Not always the same thing. She was quiet a moment. She had her arms crossed against the cold that was still in the air, the way the cold hangs on even when the sun comes out in March, and she was looking at the south slope where the snow had pulled back and left a line of wet, dark earth at its edge. How long have you been here? She said. On this place 4 years, I said. In Wyoming 11. Is this where you meant to end up? I thought about it. I didn't mean to end up anywhere specific, I said. I just kept moving until something felt like it had my name on it. She looked at me sideways, and this did. The mountains, I said, the particular way they sit to the west, and the valley the way it runs. I stood at the top of that ridge the first time the man who sold it showed me around, and I thought. I stopped. It sounded like something a younger man might say. I thought, this is worth building into. She looked at the ridge I'd pointed toward. It is, she said, just that, like she'd made her own accounting of it and come to the same number. Then she said, I'd like to learn it. I looked at her. The cattle work, she said. The pasture management. I know horses and I know housework, but I don't know cattle. I'd like to learn it if you'd teach me. I'd been waiting without knowing I was waiting for something like this. Not the words exactly, but what the words meant, which was that she was thinking about being here next year, through the summer and into fall and around to another winter. She wasn't planning to leave. She'd stopped planning to leave. She was planning to be here. I'll teach you, I said. She nodded, still looking at the slopes. The wind came up and moved her hair, and she put her hand up to it, and I could see her face sideways, and she was almost smiling. We stood there until the cold got into us and then went back inside, and she made coffee and we sat at the table, and I started telling her about the land and the grass and the rotation of a herd through seasons, and she listened the way she listened to everything, with her full attention, asking questions that told me she'd already been thinking about what she didn't yet know. An hour went by without either of us noticing. Outside, the snow was melting off the eaves, dripping in an irregular way, and the kitchen was warm and the coffee was good, and she had a piece of paper in front of her where she'd been writing things down, her handwriting clear and exact. I looked at that piece of paper and I thought, she's going to know this land better than I do inside of 3 years. That didn't bother me. I liked it actually, which surprised me a little. April, she confronted me. That's not quite the right word, but it's close. We'd had a day that went wrong from the start, a calf born wrong and not making it, then a wagon axle cracked at the worst possible time, and by evening we were both tired in the bone-deep way that has no cure except sleep. I'd been short with her once, just once over nothing, the placement of a tool, and I'd known I was wrong the moment I said it. At supper she put the plate in front of me, and then she sat across the table and said, I need you to say what you mean. I looked up. Not tonight specifically, she said. In general, you do a thing where she stopped, considered. Where you're present and careful, and you keep yourself very carefully back. And I'd like to know whether that's going to be how this goes. I put my fork down. What do you mean, how this goes? I mean, she said, looking straight at me with those steady eyes, whether you intend to go on acting like I'm a woman you found in your smokehouse who's working for room and board, or whether you're going to say what I think you probably feel. My heart was doing that thing again, the alarm, but it wasn't alarm. Ada. I'm asking plainly, she said. I'd like a plain answer. I sat back. I don't know what you think I feel, I said. I think, she said, you feel that I belong here. And I think you feel something about me that you've been treating like a thing that might break if you touch it. She held my eyes. I've been around a man who did that, who held things back and never said them, and I know how that ends. I won't do it again. That's not what this is. Then say what it is. I looked at my hands on the table, then I looked at her. I'm 53 years old, I said, and I found a half-frozen woman in my smokehouse, and she turned out to be the finest person I've had in this house in 20 years, and I didn't know how to tell you that without it sounding like something it shouldn't. I stopped. I'm saying it now. She was very still. I would like you to stay, I said, not as the hired woman. I'm asking you to consider staying because you want to be here with me. I stopped again. That's what I mean. A long quiet. Outside a horse shifted in the barn, a sound that came through clean in the stillness. You're not very good at this, she said, but she said it the way you say something that isn't a criticism. Her eyes had something in them I hadn't seen before, bright and direct. I know that, I said. I'm staying, she said. I've been staying, I decided in February. I sat there. February, I said. When you sat up with the mayor, she said. 2 nights, for a lame horse, I thought. She stopped and looked at the table and then back at me. I thought, that's the kind of man who will sit up for what matters to him, and I'd like to be around that kind of man. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I reached across the table and put my hand over hers, and she turned her hand over and held it, and we stayed like that with the stove ticking and the wind going outside, and neither one of us with anything more to say. We married in June, Judge Prentice in town, no ceremony to speak of, just the words and 2 witnesses Hoke Barber pulled off the street. Ada wore a blue dress she'd made from cloth I'd bought at the dry goods without telling her what it was for, and I remember she looked at the cloth when I brought it home and said, "What's this for?" And I said, "Whatever you want." And she'd known what I meant, and she'd gone quiet with that knowledge in a way that I carried for days afterward. After we walked out of the judge's office into the June light, and she put her hand in the crook of my arm the way you do, naturally, without ceremony, and we walked to the wagon and I helped her up and climbed up myself and we started home, and the road was just the road, the mountains off to the west the way they always are, and she said, "You'll have to let me change the kitchen around." "The kitchen's fine," I said. "The kitchen is your arrangement," she said. "I'll need to make my own arrangement." I looked at her. She was looking at the road, but there was something at the corner of her mouth. "All right," I said. She put her hand on my knee, the way she did sometimes now, easy and certain. I covered it with mine. Whitlow came himself in August. I'd known he might. The writers going back and saying the job wasn't worth it. A man like that takes that as an insult as much as a report. He came with one man, a different young one, and he was exactly what I'd expected from what I knew of him. Well dressed in a way that cost money to maintain on the frontier, and the kind of handsome that knows it, and with a particular way of arriving in a yard as if the yard were already his. Ada was in the house. She came to the window. I'd seen the curtain move. I stood in the yard. He told me who he was. Told me Ada was his wife and had been since 1878, and that I was harboring a fugitive and a thief, and that he had papers, different papers from the last men, something from a federal office, he said, and that he intended to see her and take her back, and if I stood in the way of that it would go badly for me. I listened to all of it. I kept my face the way I keep my face, which is flat and not much. When he finished I said, "Ada Whitlow is dead." He stared at me. "I beg your pardon." "Ada Whitlow died in the winter," I said. "I couldn't tell you the date exactly. Sometime in January. She came through here very bad off. We took her in. She didn't make it. We buried her on the south slope." I looked at him. "Ada Cal is my wife. She's been my wife since June. You can verify that with Judge Prentice in town. I'm sorry for your trouble." He stared at me for a long time. His jaw was working. "You're lying." "You're welcome to go to town and ask," I said. "You'll find the record. And then you're welcome to come back with whatever papers you like, and I'll refer you to my attorney, which is Bill Hadley out of Cheyenne, who's handled tougher matters than this." He had no attorney. I'd guessed that from the look of him. Men who use writers to fetch back wives don't use attorneys. "This isn't finished," he said. "I expect you'll find it is," I said. "A dead woman can't be someone's wife, and Ada Cal can't be Ada Whitlow. You might want to consider the cost of pressing a case you can't win against a man who's not going to move." I held his eyes. "It's a long way to come back." He sat there on that horse, and he was furious in the contained way of a man who knows he's out of good moves. The young man with him said nothing, just watched, and I could see he was already thinking about the ride home. Whitlow turned his horse. He didn't say anything else. He rode out and the young man followed him, and I stood in the yard until they were gone. Ada came out of the house. She stood at the door a moment, and then she walked out and came to stand next to me, where I was still watching the empty road. "He's gone," I said. "I heard. He likely won't come back." She was quiet for a moment. "Ada Whitlow is dead," she said. "That's right." She looked at the road. Then she looked at me, and I turned to look at her, and she put both her hands on my chest and looked up at me, and I could feel the warmth of her hands through my shirt, and I could see in her face something that had nothing held back in it, nothing watching for the door, nothing waiting for the blow. "Thomas," she said. "Yeah," I said. "Thank you." I put my hands over hers. She was standing close, her chin tilted up, and I could see every line of her face in the late summer light, and she looked like a woman who had finally stopped running, and it was because of me, and I knew it. And I held that for a second before she rose up, and I bent down, and it was not a soft moment. It was a held moment, the kind that gets made out of winter and a smokehouse and 2 nights with a lame horse and a man who wouldn't move. That evening she was quiet at supper, not a troubled quiet, but the kind that comes after a thing has finally closed. She ate and looked at the table, and once she looked out the window at the yard where they'd been. "It's over," I said. "I know," she said. "You don't have to keep looking for it." She looked at me. "Old habit," she said. "Then I know it's over. I can feel the difference." She put her fork down and sat back. For a long time when I was with him, every time I thought something good had happened, I'd be waiting for the next thing to undo it. You learn to not trust the good. I said nothing. "I'm working on that," she said. "You're doing all right," I said. She looked at me a long moment. "You don't say things unless you mean them," she said. "I've noticed that about you. Most men say things to fill space. You don't." "Filling space with words you don't mean is a waste," I said. "My father used to say, not in those words. He used to say you can always tell a careful man by his silences." She picked up her fork again. "He would have liked you." That hit somewhere I hadn't expected, not softly. Just directly, the way true things land. I said, "I'd have liked meeting him." She nodded and went back to eating, and we finished supper and cleared up, and the evening went the way evenings went, quietly, with the stove and the lamp and the 2 of us in our chairs. And I kept that thing she'd said in my pocket like a stone, the smooth kind, the kind you hold without thinking about it. There's a thing that happens to a man who lives alone too long, and it's not loneliness exactly, though that's part of it. It's more that you stop accounting for yourself. You stop thinking there's anyone keeping track of whether you did the right thing, said the true thing, held up your end. The man gets smaller, not in the world's eyes but in his own. You look in the mirror and you see less. I didn't know that's what had happened to me until it stopped. She kept track, not in a watching way, not the way Whitlow had kept track of her, which I understood was a keeping count. The way she did it was, she noticed when I did things right, she said so. She'd come in from the barn and say, "That fence work on the north pasture's holding better than it ought to in this ground. How'd you set the posts?" And we'd talk about it, and it was nothing, it was fence posts, but what she was saying underneath was, "I see what you can do." Or she'd come in when I was sitting at the table after a long day, just sitting, not much in me, and she'd set a cup of coffee down and put her hand on my shoulder for just a moment, and keep moving, and that was it, that was the whole thing, but it meant, "I know you're tired. You're worth knowing when you're tired." There was a morning in October, after we'd had a hard 3 days moving cattle ahead of an early storm, when I got up before light and my back had done the thing it does now and then, a deep ache from the base of the spine out through the hip, the kind of pain that makes a man old for a few days. I didn't say anything about it. I got up slow and got dressed and went to start the fire. She was already in the kitchen. She'd heard me moving around, she said, and figured I'd need the coffee early. I didn't ask how she knew it was a bad morning. She just looked at me once and didn't say anything about it, set the cup where I'd reach it, and went back to what she was doing. An hour later she'd arranged the morning's work so that the heavy end of it fell to her without making a show of it, just redistributed things quietly, the way a person does when they're paying attention to someone they care about. I noticed. I didn't say anything then. But that evening, when we were in from the work and the pain had eased some, I said, "You rearranged the morning." She was at the stove. She didn't turn around. "The fence posts could wait," she said. "They could," I said, "but that's not why you moved them." A pause. "No," she said. "I appreciate it," I said. She turned around then, looked at me across the kitchen. "You don't have to do everything alone," she said. "You know that. That's what I'm here for, not just the work, for that too." She held my eyes. "You're allowed to have help." I looked at her. "I know that," I said. "You know it in your head," she said. "You're still learning it somewhere else." She was right. I'm still learning it, if I'm honest. 53 years of handling your own weight doesn't give up easy, but I'm learning. That's not a small thing. A man my age who's been living alone as long as I had, being told with the plainness of a winter morning that he doesn't have to do it by himself anymore, that's not a small thing at all. The fall we put in more cattle. We spent September and October building out a second pasture section and moving the fence line, and I taught her what I'd said I'd teach her, the reading of the land and the needs of a herd and the particular trouble that comes with a Wyoming winter. She learned fast, as I'd expected. She had opinions, as I'd also expected, and some of them were right, and I said so, and some were wrong, and she said so first. We disagreed about the placement of the second water station, and she turned out to be correct, and I told her that too, because a man who can't say that has got some reckoning coming. There was a day in late September, warm still, the light going amber earlier every evening, when we drove the new cattle out to the north pasture together. Nothing remarkable about it. It's work. It's just moving animals from one piece of ground to another. But there was a moment when we came up over the low ridge and the whole valley opened below us, and the cattle went down the slope in that loose, unhurried way cattle go when they know where they're supposed to be, and she reined in beside me, and we both just stopped and watched it. Neither of us said anything. The light was doing something particular to the grass, the way it does in September, gold under gold, and her horse shifted under her, and she steadied him with her knee, easy and confident, and I thought, she looks like she belongs on this ridge. I'd thought things like that before and not said them. I was learning slowly to say a few more of them. "Good cattle," I said. She looked sideways at me. "That's not what you were thinking." "It's part of it," I said. She almost smiled, looked back at the valley. "I know," she said. "Me too." We sat there another minute and then rode down. By December the snow was back and the days were short and the work went inside, and we fell into the quiet rhythm of a winter house, two people who know where the other is without looking. She mended things by the lamp. I worked on the books, the accounts, which she'd started helping with because she was better at it than I was. We cooked supper together most evenings, which I hadn't done with anyone since Ellie, and it turned out it was a thing I'd missed without knowing I'd missed it. There was a particular Sunday about 3 weeks into December when a storm had us inside all day, and there was no work that needed doing and nowhere to be. I'd been reading a land survey report that I needed to understand before spring, and she'd gotten into a letter from her brother in Missouri, the first she'd let herself write and receive since coming north, and we were at the table across from each other, and after a while I looked up and she was looking at the letter and her eyes were bright, not sad but moved, the way you are when something you'd given up comes back to you. She felt me looking. "My brother has a new son," she said. "That's good news," I said. "His wife wanted to call him Clement, and he wanted to call him James," she said. "They called him James Clement." She folded the letter along its lines. "He sent the name to me first, before he told anyone else." She looked at the letter. "I didn't know if he'd still, I wasn't sure if after all of it." She stopped. "He wrote," I said. "He wrote," she said. I nodded and looked at my survey report and let it be. But she put her hand on the table, not toward me, just put it there. And after a moment I put mine beside it, and she turned hers over and held it. And we stayed that way for a while, and neither of us said anything else because nothing else needed saying. One evening, early December, we were finishing up after supper, and she was at the basin and I was putting wood on, and I heard her say, low and to herself, "I like this house." I looked up. She was still at the basin, hands in the water. "I've been in houses I didn't like," she said, not to me exactly, just saying it. "Houses where you feel the walls watching you." She stopped. "This house doesn't do that." I stood there with the wood in my arms. "It's just the house," I said. "You changed it." She turned and looked at me, a question. "When you came in and changed the kitchen around," I said, "and the arrangement of the tools in the workroom, and the other things." I set the wood in the box. "The house changed when you came into it. That's just how it goes." She stood there drying her hands on the cloth, looking at me. "That might be the nicest thing you've said to me," she said. I thought about it. "I mean it plain," I said. She smiled, which she did with her whole face when she let herself. "I know you do," she said. "That's why it's nice." She came across the room and sat in the chair near the stove, her feet tucked up the way she did in the evenings, and picked up her mending, and the lamp made a gold circle around her. And outside the snow was coming and the wind was going in the pines. And I sat down in my chair and picked up the accounts, and we were quiet together for the rest of the evening, and there wasn't a single thing wrong with any part of it. I found her in the smokehouse on a Sunday in January. That's where it started. I think about that sometimes. The whole thing balanced on a caulking iron and a draft and a Sunday I'd been putting off. If the wind hadn't changed through that particular winter, those hams might have been fine. If I'd left it another week, she might have been gone, moved on when the cold lifted some, which is what I think she'd been planning. She had that look of a woman with a plan. She would have gone and I never would have known. But the wind did change, and I went out that morning with my caulking iron. And she breathed. And I heard it. Some things you don't see coming because they come from a direction you weren't watching. A man can look at his life and account for it, the decisions he made, the losses he took, the ground he ended up on, and think he's got it mapped. And then a Sunday in January comes along and the map goes out the window. I don't know what to make of that, philosophically. I'm not a philosophical man. What I know is, I went out to seal a draft, and I came in with a woman who'd been running and had finally stopped, and between the two of us in that cold smokehouse with a lantern throwing shadows, something got decided that I couldn't have planned. She's asleep down the hall right now. I can hear the house in the way you can hear a house you know well. It sounds, the particular note the second board from the top makes, the way the stove settles in the cold, the window on the east side that flexes in wind. And underneath all of that, just barely, the rhythm of a woman who chose to stop here, in this house, with this man. I've been a man people overlooked. I don't say that to complain, it's just true. Too quiet, they figured, or too old, or too set in the ground. Men like that stop expecting to be seen. And then you get seen. Not dramatically, not with a speech, just a woman across a table who says, "I decided in February when you sat up with the mayor," who says, "I like this house," who sets her coffee cup down and says thank you in a way that means something else entirely, something that takes in the whole of it, the smokehouse and the winter and the two riders and the August afternoon and what I did and who I am. That's the thing you can't plan and can't make happen and can't buy. You just have to be the man who sits up with the mayor, and do it because it's right and keep doing it and be there when she sees it. That's all. The snow's going tonight. I can tell by the way the wind shifted. In the morning the south pasture will be white and still and she'll come down before I'm up. She always does, and start the coffee, and we'll have breakfast and go out and see what the storm left us. And there'll be a fence line to check. There always is, and we'll do it together. That's the life. That's the whole life, and it's enough.